We have heard a lot of interesting things today about the future. And we started the day with Alex talking about the past. We've heard a lot about mind control, gestural interaction, new technologies which are very, very exciting and will push UX design beyond its roots as, in terms of designing for the web, designing for that flat screen, and designing for that world with a keyboard and a mouse. And this is this big transition point that we are going through. And I think one of the big themes here of the day has been, what does that really mean? What is that transition really going to be about? My background is as an information architect. And I think mostly about interaction. I think about how we interact with the information that we encounter, and how, as we make this transition, these new technologies can be designed in a way to change the way we think about interaction as designers. I think right now we have a very thin understanding of interaction, how and why people interact with the world. This is true, I think, for information, and I think it's also true for the physical things like Mike was just talking about. As computation, in his words, shatters and becomes embedded in all of the different systems around the world, the things that I'm going to talk about here today I think are going to become more important, and I think many of the things we've heard today, all the things we've heard today, are pointing to this future. Now, I wasn't always an information architect. I started actually as a physicist, a wannabe physicist. And when I took a physics class, and I remember very early on, the professor came in and told a story about going to work as a young scientist for the summer at the National Research Council in Ottawa. I'm from Canada. And he told the story about being a junior researcher and going in, and he was assigned a room with a desk. And there were two desks in that room, actually. The other desk was a senior physicist. And this senior physicist would come in every day with a paper and a cup of coffee and would sit down and read and then put it away and put his feet up, put his hands behind his head, and stare at the ceiling all day long. And he did this day after day after day. My professor, as a junior scientist, as a junior physicist, sat in this room and was livid. Because he came into the room every day, and he pulled out his pencil and his paper, this was back in the 1950s, and he worked. Right? He was actually doing physics. What is this guy doing? He's getting paid a lot more, and he's doing nothing. And then one day, after a month or two, the physicist is sitting there. He pulls his hands back, sits down, and says, "I've got it. I understand. I know what to do," pulls out and a fury of scribbles for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And the way I was told this story was, this is what a physicist does. This is how a physicist works. This is how a physicist thinks. Right? Deep thought. It left a deep impression on me as a young physicist, and I have come to believe it is rubbish. Absolute rubbish. It is a fiction, this story. This is Richard Feynman, the enfant terrible of American physics, one of the three great physicists of the 20th century, along with Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking. Why? He was a very unusual figure, like the other two. He made major contributions, world-class breakthroughs, and he did those breakthroughs well into his 40s, 50s, and even into his 60s. All three of them were towering figures. James Gleick wrote a very lengthy biography about him in the late 80s. And in that, he quotes a historian who went and talked to Feynman and asked him about his work. And the historian, knowing that Feynman was a great figure, a legend in the world of physics, and physics was, of course, the science of the 20th century, wanted to, before Feynman died, understand how he had come to his insights. And he asked him this: how did you do it? And he said, I actually did the work on the paper. Well, the work was done in your head, but the record of it is still here. No, no, Feynman says. It's not a record. What's on the paper is working. You have to work on the paper, and this is the paper. This is the paper. This is the work. What is he doing when he's writing? He is interacting with the world, and what he is saying is that that is part of how he thinks. What is thinking? That is my big question here for us. What is thinking, and how does it relate to interaction? Now, when we think about thinking, if we go back to do a little history here, for a long time, we had in the world, we had what was called behaviorism. And the basic idea of behaviorism was that we cannot know what goes inside people's heads. It's a box, and we cannot open that box. We have inputs and we have outputs, but woe befall anyone who attempts to understand what is going on inside the head. And that was eventually, that gave us things like Pavlovian training at Pavlov and Pavlov's dog and operant conditioning and all of these things, and it continues to play out in a whole bunch of different areas. That led to cognitivism and cognitive science, modern cognitive science. And the idea there is, we can actually understand the workings of the brain. We can do this if we're clever about it. And this led to the modern theory, which is called the computational theory of mind, which essentially says that your mind is a computer. It's not a computer like your PC or your phone, but it does computation. There are operations, and that's what cognition is. It is mental operations associated with information and with knowing, with knowledge. And now we have neuroscience and modern neuroscience with magnetic resonance imaging, which allows us to see what the brain is doing, and we can break this down, and you hear all these wonderful stories, right? All of these scientific discoveries. And what this all says is we have this idea, we've got this chain in which thinking, what is thinking? The answer is, it's stuff that happens in your head. That is what thinking is, right? Isn't it? So what's 34 and 4? 38, very good. What's 34 times 4? $136, took a little longer, but we can mentally do that. What's 34 to the 4th power? I have no idea. But you could solve it, right? You could use something else. You could use a pen and some paper. You could use a computer. Is that thinking? Where does the thinking happen? When you're using some other thing. Here's a jigsaw puzzle. There are 200 pieces to this jigsaw puzzle. Just by looking at it, is this a solvable puzzle? Are there enough pieces here, and can they all be arranged together to create a coherent picture? It's pretty difficult, so I'll simplify it. There's 20 pieces. Can you do it? Still kind of hard, isn't it? Now there's 6. Can you do it? Can you solve it? You're looking at it, you're rotating the pieces in your mind, right? You're thinking about it, maybe you're moving them around. You can't actually solve it. There's a piece missing. How do we think? Now, how would you solve that normally? You would put the pieces down and you would move them around, right? But is that thinking? My question here is, why not just look at that? You look at this here, all the information is right there. It's right there. You can see it. There's not a lot of information. There are 6 pieces. Why, for something even simple like that, is it easier to do it by manipulating something in the world? Why not just think? Or when you're playing Scrabble, you've got a series of 7 letters. They've done a study around this. I can point you to a paper where they had a group of people come in and they said, all right, we would like you to come up with word combinations, but you can't move the tiles. And another group came in and they said, you can come up with some word combinations, move the tiles if you want to. Guess what happens? Right? The people who move the tiles are able to find more words in less time. Isn't that an interesting idea? This is a very simple, everyday kind of thing. This is another everyday thing that we all do, right? We stand in front of that board and we're filled with sticky notes and we have to think, but why do we interact with it at all? Why don't we just look at it and do the stuff that's in our head? And the reason is because we do not think just in our heads. To think, that word's tricky, isn't it? To think that thinking is something that happens just inside your brain is a very limited idea. It turns out we don't think that way. However, if we think about modern neuroscience, that's what we're told. Cognitive science says that's the way cognition is defined. There's this brain-bound idea of cognition, but there is another idea of cognition, another idea of thinking. And this other idea of thinking is what we call the extended mind. There's actually a couple of different versions of this. But the idea of the extended mind here is essentially that your mind is coupled to the world around you. And it's that connection to the world around you that you have this larger cognitive system. Let me explain this a bit. A key idea in the extended mind hypothesis is what's called the parity principle. If some process works in a way that we would count it as cognitive if it were done in the head, then we would count it as cognitive if it is done outside the head, if it is done in the world. That's the big idea in the extended mind hypothesis. So, 34 to the 4th power, when you're using a pen to write that down and work it all out, or you're typing something on your calculator, or you're entering it into a computer of some sort, that is part of your mind. Isn't that an interesting idea? Do you have any way of accounting for that idea when you design? In the extended mind hypothesis, your phone is not a phone. It is part of your brain. It is connected to you just as much as anything else in the world. Now, this is a classical idea that comes out of cognitive science that models people. Right? This is from a paper called An Overview of the Epic Architecture for Cognition and Performance with Application to Human-Computer Interaction. Note, I do not have ears. I have an auditory processor. I do not have hands. I have manual motor processors. And apparently, I don't have feet either. But this is sort of this arc from behaviorism to cognitive science, where we're looking to try to break down people, and this is how we think of them. And oh, there's this task environment, et cetera. It's very mechanistic, isn't it? Right? It's inputs and outputs. And when it comes to the computer's understanding of us, it's not much different. Right? Now, this was developed for a long time ago, back when everything was keyboards and mice, or almost everything was keyboards and mice. But still, I mean, does your phone think of you as having a whole lot more than one finger or one thumb? I mean, yeah, it's multi-touch kind of, but other than, say, maybe zooming, you don't really do a whole lot more with it than that. Still, one pointer. That's it. Here's a question for you. Why do we talk with our hands? You ever thought about that? Why do we talk with our hands? All day long, there's been a parade of people up here, and we have been talking, and we have been using our hands. Why? Basic answer, right? Standard answer. I am doing it the same way that if I talked quietly, or I yelled really loudly, or I paused, all that carries extra information. So the hand gestures carry extra information. I'm doing it for you. good answer, a true answer. Why do I talk with my hands when I'm on the phone? Anyone here do that? Yes, yes, we all do that, right? So a good answer there is learned behavior. I'm used to talking with my hands when there are other people around, so when no one is there, it's just sort of carried over. So why do blind people talk with their hands? People who cannot see a hand talk with their hands. And they talk with their hands when they are talking to someone else who also has no sight. When you have two people, neither of whom can see a hand, are standing there, they're talking to each other back and forth, they're always gesturing. Isn't that fascinating? It turns out it's so fascinating, there's some psychologists who've been looking at that question for 20 years. Dozens and dozens of studies. So they'll take, say, a group of kids, say 10, 12 years old, half of them will be sighted, half of them will be blind. They will give them both the same reasoning task and ask them to explain their understanding of the problem to someone else afterwards. Both groups will use hand gestures. Not only that, but they both use very similar kinds of hand gestures. There's something fundamental going down here where our hands are somehow connected up here. This is the conclusion of this work is that our hands we don't just use our hands when talking for the people out there. It doesn't just direct outwards to someone else. It also directs inward. It doesn't just direct to the object, it directs also to myself. I do it for me. Hands actually shape thought. When you see someone, say a panel discussion at a conference, and somebody asks a question, and somebody is kind of struggling, watch their hands. You will see this happen. They'll sit there and they'll be, I'm not, and then their hands will start moving. And it's like this cognitive grease, and the words begin to tumble out. There's some fascinating studies around this. We talk with our hands. This doesn't account for that. This doesn't account for that. There are a lot of theories that do, or that are trying to. They go by a number of different words. One of the big ones is called embodied cognition, or embodiment, which you have probably heard of. That one is really about a very simple idea, ultimately. If I can simplify this down to 3 words, which is grossly oversimplified, but Descartes was wrong. Right? Mind-body duality is an interesting idea in theory, but it is not actual reality. It's a good construct, but there's a point where that really, really breaks down. Distributed cognition is a related idea. In distributed cognition, we view the world as representational states, and it's the transfer of representations within and across mediums, where mediums include your phone, pieces of paper, things that you see in the world, representations of information in your mind, representations in other people's minds. Distributed cognition doesn't argue that classic cognitive science is wrong. It's just wildly incomplete, because it thinks about cognition as being something that happens inside the skull. And that explanation does not account, cannot account for so many everyday things. For why we rearrange Scrabble tiles, to why we talk with our hands, and much, much more. And when you begin to look at the world in this way, you begin to see this everywhere. There are some other ones, cognitive activity theory, something called cognitive integration, and as I mentioned earlier, the extended mind. But these are all generally in that same kind of idea. Cognition happens everywhere. Now, you do not need to believe me on this. Think of it as a spectrum. On the one side of the spectrum, way over here, we have the brain-bound view. This very traditional, classic idea that we should define thinking as something that happens inside the skull. It is very much bound up in there. And then we have this other one way on the other side where, wow, when I've got my phone in my hand, it is literally, literally, literally a part of my mind. You do not need to be over here. All I'm trying to do is to say that right now we are probably over here. And there are advantages for us as designers if we begin to move ourselves a little bit this way. Because if we don't, we're not going to be able to truly understand what's going on with Connect. We're not really going to be able to take advantage of some of the stuff around Internet of Things, gestures. All of these kinds of new interactions are going to have limitations unless we reorient ourselves and begin to see the world in new ways. And isn't that what we try to do as designers? We try to see the world in new ways. We try to see things that other people don't, to make the world. Anyone play Tetris? Remember Tetris? Very simple game, right? You got these little blocks. You can only do 4 things. You can move them left. You can move them right, just like Guy did this morning with his brain. You can rotate them or drop them into position. That's all. Some scientists were interested in how people learn to play Tetris. They did a very careful keystroke level analysis of people playing Tetris. Classical theory predicts that as you get better, right, as you become more experienced and become a better player, you will make fewer mistakes, right? So you try to learn something new, whatever it happens to be, right? Learn something new, you make mistakes. And as you do it more, as you practice, you make fewer mistakes. So one of the things that you see in Tetris is you've got those blocks. You move them, say, 2 spaces to the left, and then you move it a 3rd space, and you think, damn, that wasn't right. You move it back. Or you rotate it, and then you rotate it again. You think, oh, no, just one time was enough. So you've over-rotated, and you have to rotate it back around. So in this study, they looked at how people learned to play Tetris. And they took people who were very, very basic, had no experience with the game at all, had them play. And what happened? Oh, something kind of interesting. It turned out that as people played the game more, they made more mistakes. They over-rotated the pieces more. They moved them left and right more. So how can we call these mistakes anymore? Right? Why would you deliberately over-rotate the piece? So they tried to come up with an explanation for this. And what they did was they distinguished between 2 types of interactions. Now, what's interesting to me about this Tetris study also is that when people did this, it wasn't just that as they played the game more, they would over-rotate more, but the best players, the players who got the highest scores, they over-rotated the most. So they distinguished between 2 things, what they called pragmatic action. And the idea of pragmatic action is an action that one takes in the world to achieve a certain desired goal state in the world. Example. I am thirsty. I want a drink of water. So I walk over. I am moving towards a desired goal state in the world. I pick up the water. Okay. I am thirsty. I walk over and I pick up something else instead, or I don't go in the right direction. I do something else. I've moved away from that desired goal state. A mistake, an error. But how then do you explain people over-rotating those pieces? Why are they doing it? And so they introduced a concept that they called an epistemic action. And an epistemic action, as in epistemology, right? As in the philosophy of knowledge. And these are actions that you do in the world to make mental computation faster or simpler or less prone to error. Rearranging pieces, Scrabble tiles. Moving around pieces on your jigsaw puzzle. Standing in front of the board of sticky notes and moving things around rather than trying to think in your head. And the argument here is that we do epistemic actions all the time. We are constantly doing epistemic actions because the way that we interact with the world is part of how we think. There is a lovely book called HCI Remixed. It was written about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's a collection of papers by people in human-computer interaction reflecting on a piece of research that they had read that changed their worldview, that made them go, aha. And I remember pulling out the book. So the papers themselves are not in it. It's just essays that people wrote about those papers and how those papers influenced their thinking. I remember pulling out the book and looking through it and thinking, is the Tetris paper in there? And it wasn't for anyone. But if I had been asked to contribute to that book, and there's no way that I ever would have, but if I had, I would have picked this paper because when I read this, the light came on. I was like, I can't believe that I didn't see this before. And now I can't see anything without thinking about it in these terms. So when you see someone, you're doing a usability study, right? And someone's maybe flailing around and they're going down the wrong path. Is that truly a mistake? We tend to think that it is. It may not be. We tend to design to simplify, to reduce the amount of interaction that people have. Really, right? We want to make it easier to use. Curious thing in, say, I don't know, lots of things where people like to learn things. Making stuff too easy leads to shallow learning or no learning at all. Effortfulness is actually important, quite important, and yet we're trying to wash it away. Think about epistemic actions in terms of chess. You have a bishop, and you want to move that bishop. So you take it and you move it, but you keep your finger on it, right? And then you realize, oh, that was a bad move, so you move it back. If you're an interaction designer and you're modeling this, you would say there are two actions. You did one thing, and then you pressed undo. And if we think of the world only in terms of pragmatic action, as though all actions are the same essentially, and we don't have this concept of this, then it is a mistake. But if we have this concept of epistemic actions, then what we have is we can see this for its value. You don't move that bishop for the change it brings about in the world. You move that bishop for the change it brings about in yourself, in your understanding of the world. I think this might give us a somewhat different lens when we're doing user research, when we're doing usability studies, trying to interpret what people are doing and why they're doing, and not thinking about the thinking happening just up here. It's like we have two pictures. I want to go from A to B, and we design as though, let's make this as smooth and straight a line as possible. And this big, messy line that happens that I keep seeing people do, wow, that is unnatural. It isn't. I think this is one of the ways in which we really need to begin recognizing that there are elements about the messy human behavior that is really actually advantageous. And epistemic actions is part of that. Now, the design of everyday things, and I know Don Norman has been referenced at least once today, maybe several times, belongs in that small category of books that people in user experience design have either read or feel guilty about not reading. It gave us a whole series of concepts which were true then, have been true ever since, and will continue to be true and useful, very useful. Doesn't matter any of the systems that we're talking about. We had, for example, in the Connect presentation this morning with the game, with the cart, or the horse guiding the horse, and we had the two reins, right? The solution was to provide visual feedback by highlighting green on the one cart, or on the one rein immediately. That's an old concept. Nothing new there. There's also, though, in the book, this idea. This is called the decision-action cycle. And in the decision-action cycle, we have goals, and then we form an intention to act. We have a sequence of actions, and we execute the action sequence. This is something that is done to the world. The world changes. We perceive the state of the world. We interpret the perception, and we evaluate the interpretations. Then we form new goals and continue the loop again. Many, if not all, of the HCI textbooks that I have looked at have this model. This over here is called the gulf of execution. This side over here is called the gulf of evaluation. It is a classic model in HCI. It is a deep conceptual assumption that this is how people interact with the world. Does it ring any bells? Does it look like anything that any of the things I've been talking about here today? I like to simplify the picture like this. Right? We've got cognition, we have the world, we have action, and we have perception. We've got this little loop that goes around, and there's a couple of things to note about the way I've drawn this. Cognition is really big, right? It's big and complicated, right? That's what neuroscience tells us, because if it was small, we would already have an artificial brain, which we don't. Right? It's really, really hard. If you read anything in the cognitive science literature, they will always talk about how the brain is the most sophisticated, complicated thing in the universe. This is a very object-oriented notion, right? There's an object, right? This thing, the brain, and it doesn't really have an idea that it's connected to the rest of the world. And that's what else you see in this diagram, right? Cognition, action, the world, perception, these are discrete pieces. The world is also really big, and we sure know that. Mike just spent a whole bunch of time talking about it, right? The world is really complicated, all these physical things. Action and perception, well, that's just input and output, right? This morning, Alex showed this picture, right, of Paul Otway and his ideas. The intelligence. Things go into the brain. And look at all this big, complicated stuff in the world. Right? Wow, the world is big and complicated. And it just goes right into the skull. In fact, it goes so much into the skull that it's almost like cleaved off at the top. Right? We'll just like cut the brain out, we'll cut the head open and lift the top off, pour a bunch of stuff in. Right? This is an old, really deep-seated idea, especially in Western philosophical thought. It's really deep. And I think we are going to have to work really hard to unhorse ourselves from this. So I think this is a better picture. Cognition is still big. The world is still big. But action and perception is also big. Both of them are big, and they overlap. My brother is not a duck. But he studies ducks. He lives in the Canadian Arctic. He is an Arctic waterfowl ecologist. And what that means is he studies ducks in cold places. Note, he doesn't study ducks. He doesn't study cold places. He studies ducks in cold places. He cannot do this work without understanding the two together. Because you can't understand a duck without understanding other ducks. And you can't understand a duck without understanding nests. And you can't understand ducks and nests without understanding the environment in which they live. Oh, and then there's all the other species and all the other animals, and then there's the plants. That's what ecology is. It's big, it's complicated, it's really messy, and it looks at everything together. It's a systems view of the world. Right? Scrabble. Someone is playing Scrabble. What do you see? Do you see a person with a bunch of thoughts going on in their head and then going, okay, I'll move a couple of tiles? Or do you see a system? You cannot understand Scrabble players by looking just at the tiles or looking just at the player. You have to understand them together. Right? Same with the jigsaw puzzle. Same with the phone. Same with all of these devices. All of them. And we have seen a lot of them here today. Some fabulous things. Things where you think, I want that Facebook button, the want button, I want to click that. Right? But as designers, somebody have a phone? Can I borrow someone's phone very briefly? All right, Danny, thank you. I'm going to teach a class to undergraduates next semester on human-computer interaction. And I've already decided what my opening lecture is going to be. The first 2 minutes. It's going to be this. I'm going to get a phone. What is that? That is nothing. It is nothing at all. What is this? This is power, right? This is cognitive application. This is knowledge. This is important, right? It's this connection. And in fact, even this is kind of simple because really it doesn't show everything. It doesn't show me as part of some other environment. I got this big blank stage up here. It doesn't connect to all the other things in my environment. It doesn't really, we need to think about how this is connected through the network to other people. It's those connections that are really, really important. And so in teaching that class, what I want to do is I want to get people to understand it is not the thing that matters. The thing by itself is nothing. It's all the rest of it, that thing connected to it, that thing as part of and an extension of my mind and how I think, right? That is part of how I think. So that is what is thinking. We have a very simplistic notion of thought. It's not this, it's more like this. Now, this is one of the iconic pictures of Steve Jobs. This is the picture that appeared inside Time magazine when the Macintosh was launched. And what does it say? This is him at home. It says, here is the genius. Note how clean, how minimalist, how stark this is. This is the genius at home. This is how the genius thinks. Right? This is where greatness comes from. And we see this embodied in all the Apple products, right? This kind of idea. Right? There's this reflection of this in the iPhone and everything that Mac does, and now so many companies trying to emulate that. So if this is one of the more iconic pictures of Steve Jobs, this is my favorite. Do you notice anything? This is Steve Jobs at home. This is his home office. It's messy, isn't it? There's a lot of things here. There's books, right? There's computers. There's piles of stuff. Right? You know, it's the opposite of what Apple wants us to believe the future is going to be about. Right? In the future, in the digital future, everything is clean and tidy. It's like a science fiction movie from the 1960s. Right? And yet here we've got piles of stuff all over the place. This is where creativity happens. What's your office like? Is it nice and neat and tidy all the time? And I work in a university. Walk around to faculty offices. Oh my God. And yet, that's the wrong response. It's not, oh my God, how do people think? It's like, oh my God, look at how they're thinking. Look at how they're actually working. So this, I love that picture. And earlier today, Alex showed this picture of Paul Otley's office. Messy piles. And this was a recreation of how his office actually was. You see this again and again. Why are we trying to design for a world where everything is neat and tidy? Now, there are cases where we can't just let everybody do whatever they want, right? We do need to design to support. And there are times when neatness is important, and order and organization. And as an information architect, I can't tell you how deeply I believe that. But I have also come to believe that we overstructure the world in certain ways, or we structure it in the wrong kinds of ways. We don't structure it to support thought. We structure it to support it as though there's the world out there and there's thought up here. This is the world that we were told we were going to be building, right? Nice, neat, clean. And this is the world, the digital world that we've created now, and that we keep thinking this is the way it's going to be. And this is the digital reality, right? How many people have a desktop like this? Right? And if you don't have a desktop like this, how many people have like a file system where you're like, oh God. Oh no, there's so much stuff here and there. Right? This is the way the world is. And this is a reflection of how people think. It's not necessarily a reflection of bad design. But I do think it's a reflection of design not being able to see this for what it is. Because after all, this is how we work, isn't it? We work this way ourselves. This is not just how we work, this is how we think. This is how we understand the people that we are designing for. This is how we break down the problems. We think in environments like this all the time. So there's a number of UX studios who are moving in the direction of basically not just renting an office, but renting a particular office and designing that space. It's not a place for working, it's a machine for thinking, where people are very integral parts of that machine, and all the different devices that you have are part of that, and the paper and the Post-it notes on the walls, these are all really fundamental. And that's a very different view than that story I was told when I was a young wannabe physicist, all idealistic, and told, just sit there and think. The world of psychology and cognitive science is fascinating. And there are some amazing pieces of research and some incredible insights that have been developed by pursuing our understanding of human beings through these models, through behaviorism and through cognitive science. And in fact, behaviorism still continues to have a great deal of importance. If people in the cognitive science often talk about it being overthrown in the dark days of behaviorism, but things like apps around exercise and weight loss are all based on ideas around behaviorism. Right? It's still a hugely important area. It's all behavior modification. Right? Any of you have ever read books on, like self-help books, or books on, say, productivity and time management? A lot of those rely on tricks around behavior modification with an understanding of psychology. So I am not in any way suggesting that these views are wrong. That is not the case. What I'm merely trying to say here is that these views are incomplete, and that these views are deeply, deeply embedded in how we think about the world. And there are certain assumptions that we don't even really recognize as assumptions anymore. Think about search and how search has changed. It's changed a lot. When you go back to the early days of information retrieval and how people searched and developing the very first search systems, the idea was that you would put in a query and you would get a series of results. That was the intention here. And in that connection, right, as you kept developing it and developing these search technologies, starting from the back in the 1960s, that idea continued. So that today, if you look at how those search systems are formally evaluated in a very technical way, the ideal search system is one in which for any person, for every particular search that you want to do, you will get all the relevant results and only the relevant results. And the first item is always going to answer your information-seeking behavior problem, right? Your information need. Done. Well, that's kind of a lot of rubbish, I think. Right? It's unrealistic. It can't be done. Every information need that I might ever have. And yet, this is the basic assumption. But it's not just that. Those search systems were based on the idea, and if you go back and read that material, it's very interesting because there's all these papers talking about, well, what would make for a good search environment? Well, we need to have good metadata. And we need to have controlled vocabularies, and we need to have we don't want to have a lot of duplicate content, and we want to have authoritative information. And we will never be able to get good quality and highly scaled search, right, to large search collections, unless our document collections look like that. Does the web look anything like that? Right? In fact, the web and web search actually works because we have a completely opposite search environment. And Google recognized that, right? That's what PageRank does. Try going and searching the library, right? And traditional or like journal databases or a lot of the traditional, those types of systems, or Westlaw or LexisNexis and things like that, and then go try searching the web. And there's one of the big reasons is not just because it has a lot to do with certain kinds of assumptions and the kinds of documents that are involved there. That has a lot to do with it. But there's another interesting assumption as well. It was always assumed that when people created metadata for a system, that metadata was going to be accurate. And that you, as the person who was creating the metadata for that document, had a vested interest in being as honest and truthful as possible. Yeah, how's that played out on the web? Right? Lie, lie, lie. Right? So, like search, I've come to think that we could not have done Google and search for the web without that original phase of search. Right? But we could not also have done Google and web without somebody, in this case Page and Brin, recognizing that there was a fundamental set of assumptions that were not going to be true, and that if you threw a couple of those away, you could transform. Behaviorism, cognitive science, cognitivism, these ideas, huge amount of value there. But I am also, the examples I've tried to give you today around jigsaw puzzles, Tetris, right, talking with your hands, point to some assumptions, some problems in that thinking that may very well limit us. They haven't been a big deal when we had a world of keyboard and mice. But as we have a new world, and we've been hearing a lot about that world today, I think it's going to be a much bigger problem. Because ultimately, there are two worlds. There's the world that my brother lives in, right? The world of science, the world as it is. Right? The world of the duck in the cold Canadian Arctic. And then there's the other world, and that's the world that I live in, and it's the world that every one of us lives in. It's the world that is designed. It is the world as it may be. And if we are really going to make that world, we've always known that we need to understand information, we need to understand technology, we need to understand people. Right? If we're going to understand people, we need to understand how they think. Because we live in a world where we talk about information overload. And we've got a curve that looks like this, right? It's just been going crazy. And now we live in a world where Douglas Copeland, we think he's right when he says you can have information or you can have a life, but you can't have both. Right? And if Mike's vision of the future is right, you can have like things or you can have a life, but you can't have both. There's going to be a lot more things. But that's not the only curve. Right? We haven't seen just an explosion in information. We've seen an explosion in computation and devices and people who are using them and how deeply they are embedded in their lives. Think about all the things that have been invented in the last 10 years that people would not get rid of. iPhone, iPad, Xbox, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, right? The list just goes on, and that's like just 10 years. Right? This is infrastructure now. And when it comes to all this information, we have been working really hard, arguably since the dawn of civilization, to figure out ways to create, distribute, publish, search, collect, share, and consume information. I don't have an information problem. Do you? I do have an understanding problem. I am overwhelmed with information. I can find so much. So the world that I think we need to be thinking about, right? To do this, we need to unhorse ourselves from certain assumptions, but we need to recognize certain realities of the world. Today, we heard a lot about new technologies, new ways of interacting, about things and how manufacturing will change things, about how to innovate in this world and how to think about innovation. And if I was to leave you with anything today, it would be with two thoughts. The first thought is that we have a thin understanding of how we interact with the world. And we need a deeper understanding about what I call deep interaction. And there's a lot of different words, like I mentioned: embodiment, distributed cognition, extended mind, right? That notion of epistemic actions. But generally, the idea here is we don't just think inside the skull. We think with the world around us. And the things that we are designing are extensions. They are connected to us. They are part of how we think. And I don't just mean emotionally, right? And the other thing is that in this world that we are building, in this world that we are designing for, that we are responsible for designing for, a world where we need to recognize the reality of this, that information is cheap and understanding remains expensive. And this, I think, is one of the great design challenges that we have. Thank you.